The program came down to rejecting the Memorandum of Agreement, promising to immediately repeal 8 laws which implemented the memoranda, ending a good many collective bargaining rights, cutting back on the minimum wage and other welfare benefits, etc. That they would immediately repeal those laws, for which they did not need negotiations with anybody in the European Union. They would repeal those laws as soon as a majority in Parliament met. The second was to immediately begin changing the Greek state from a patronage, clientelist state. And it's very important to stress that people in Greece, and certainly the activists and leadership of Syriza, see that as relatively autonomous from the crisis, although related to it. There's an acute awareness, it's very true, and Greg and my colleague, comrade in the Political Science Department at York, Saba al-Maseri, has done some great work on this, that those states that came out of the Ottoman Empire have generally not developed Weberian rational states, states with a rational civil service and bureaucracy. And that's very true of the Greek state. There's a very strong sense and a very strong commitment that the end of the patronage state needs finally to be established. The guy who introduced the economic program when the policy was launched, and I'll read you later a very moving introduction he wrote. His name is Giannis Dragakis, he's a politician in his mid-70s, said as part of the economic reform, right at the beginning of the economic reform, said the following. The first point I would like to refer to is this: why reforms? Measures are necessary, but in this country, the first presidential decree for the establishment of a land registry was issued in 1831, by the first governor of the country. Even today, we lack a complete land registry. The first announcement for setting up a wealth registry was made by Prime Minister Trikoupis in 1893. Still in 2012, we do not have a comprehensive wealth registry. The first serious attempt to reform public administration was made by Venizelos. Even today, we are living with the half-hearted measures that were adopted then. The first serious discussion about reforming the tax regime were launched in 1955 by Venizelos, a bourgeois economist. The reforms he proposed have yet to be implemented. So when are we actually going to do all this, if not now, when? And who will implement this, if not a government of the left? But I think this really needs to be stressed. And so it's not a matter of simply the Europeans or the Germans saying the Greek state is inefficient, it can't collect taxes, etc. It is in fact true. Okay? And a central plank in Syriza's program, but also in Antarsya's and the KKE, insofar as it has one, though the KKE has no intention of forming government this way, is to introduce a wealth registry and a wealth tax. Right? And that would have to include a land registry and a land tax, and that's one of the reasons that rural Greeks are not so excited about Syriza. All right, now, in the platform as well is a commitment to nationalize and socialize the bank. This goes back a long way, as I said. There was a big debate at the most recent party conference over whether the word nationalization should be used. The ones who said socialization should be used had the majority. One should be careful with this, however. It was the most revolutionary members of Syriza who said that they voted for socialization rather than nationalization, because nationalization usually means you take them over and give them back. Or you take them over and they perform the same function as they perform by private banks in the system. That's not to say there weren't people who were hoping that they could fudge it, right? By not using nationalization, and that they might be able to not be hammered so much in the press if they didn't use it. But I think one has to be very careful with this. And what's significant is that when Tsipras launched the program on the Friday I was there, 4 days after that strategy and planning committee met. He explicitly used the word nationalizing the banks and then socializing them, and explained that what that meant was that you would have social control from below, not only government control from above. Now, that said, the actual final program doesn't use the word nationalization. Okay? So these are straws in the wind, no doubt, and I want to talk about that. At the center of the program is, of course, what's to happen with Europe and the euro. And although you might think, and some people have said, that Syriza has been tactically very smart and clever, not to say they would pull out of the euro, but to promise that they'd be able to negotiate with the Europeans of doing away with the memorandum. Right? And that this is just therefore a tactic, knowing very well the Europeans won't agree to this if they reject the memorandum, if they reject the austerity. So you might as well be calling, as Antarsya does, and as the KKE is held on to, for getting out of Europe, and having been a disaster. Right? But they, you could say, are being tactically smart by appealing to those who don't want to leave the euro, as most people in Greece are either emotionally attached to or fearful of doing. Right? That they've been tactically smart, but in fact it isn't just a matter of tactics. There is no question that the vast majority of the leadership of the party, and I would say a vast majority of the activists in it, are emotionally attached to staying in Europe. Right? This is not a mere tactic. And those who are more politically sophisticated, and there are plenty of them in the leadership and amongst activists, will say we see the struggle we're engaged in as contributing to changing the balance of forces in Europe. We think the worst thing that could happen to the struggle we've been engaged in is for the Greek struggle to become marginalized. One member, young member of the Central Committee said, while I was there was an enormous public meeting, in fact the same night I spoke at the Antarsya thing, with Zizek and Tsipras together, attracted enormous media attention, thousands and thousands of people. And the serious people in the party were worried about this, because although Zizek has written all over Europe in favor of Syriza, he is a complete loose cannon. Often you know what he's talking about. His public speaking demeanor is constantly scratching his nose and wiping his snot on his shirt. And it didn't turn out to be a disaster, but one of the Central Committee speakers said, I wish we had brought people from the insurgents in Spain rather than Zizek in terms of trying to show that we want to change the balance of forces in Europe. So I think this is a strategic, and you could say revolutionary commitment not to pull out. That said, you could say that they are dreaming in Technicolor. The notion that they would, as they propose, suspend payments of interest on the debt, right? Ask for moratoria, institute moratoria on the payment of a good part of the debt, even the principal, right? And only service that debt that remained in relation to the rate of economic development and economic growth in Greece. That was what they were going to come with as a bargaining chip, right? And you could say, this was dreaming in Technicolor, and I'm going to talk in a minute about the extent to which it was. But I want to stress that that was primarily what they were, as far as they were thinking through. Okay? There was a small group of economists, entirely in secret, two groups of them actually, trying to work out a plan B, should they be kicked out. But their feeling was, one, it's going to be very hard to kick us out. There is no mechanism for people to be kicked out of the euro, let alone the European Union. So this isn't going to be easy. And they were very aware, and I certainly was very aware, and told them a lot about it, that the reason that the IMF was being so soft compared to the Germans, compared to the European Central Bank, etc., was that the Americans, they know, you see a party that might come to government that has communist roots way back in its ancient history, and they don't know who the fuck might be there. I mean, I'm sure there are spies inside the organization, but still, are they going to turn to Chavez for funds if they get kicked out of the euro. Even worse, if they're going to turn to Ahmadinejad, one very old party member who had been in the Communist Party and then in the KKE interior for a long time, said he knew for sure that the Russians had already approached them with an offer for money. So it's very clear, and Syriza has been getting much better press in the New York Times than it's been getting in Europe, let alone in Greece. And I think that does have to do with the Americans generally being upset with the Germans for the degree of austerity they're throwing at the crisis in Europe in general, and the instability it's causing, as opposed to what the Americans do, which is just to throw money at the banking system, and have contained crises as a result quite successfully. There's also that geopolitical factor that Syriza was counting on, or hoping for at least, in terms of restraining the Europeans from kicking it out. Now, I think one needs to say very honestly, and a young member of the Central Committee said this very honestly, what is going on here now is something like a revolution. If you look at the protests in the streets, if you look at the degree of mobilization, if you look at the lack of legitimacy of the state, even from those who are voting in fear for new democracy, and a lot of people said that, who were voting for new democracy, what's going on is something like a revolution, but if we get elected, we're not introducing socialism. This is not about taking over the means of production, even if we do nationalize the banks. Right? Let's be clear about that. This is a process. And as the head of the Policy Planning Committee said to me, quoting a Spanish poet, we will make the path by walking on it. Even though he's very proud of the 300-page program that he had been so central as a philosopher, a very famous philosopher in Greece, he'd be so central to writing, you know, we don't know what we're walking into. And we realize that we're going to be making the path by walking on it. One of them said, adventurism is a bad word, and rightly so. But like it or not, we're now engaged on a great adventure that we don't know we're going to know where it's going to be. The leading pollster for the party opened the meeting of the Policy and Planning Committee by saying, there's a danger we can win. And a lot of senior people on the staff of Sinus Pismos, essentially, were hoping they wouldn't, because they simply felt that the party was not ready for forming a government. Now, some of them would put that in the form of, we don't have a clue who we would appoint as ministers. One of them even joked at this party meeting, just shows you what the tenor of the political culture is, right? Look, we haven't decided yet whether we're going to disband the army. You can see the kind of political culture it is. Right? It was a joke, everyone laughed. But Tsipras explicitly promised when he introduced the program that they were going to disband the riot police. But serious people in the party said, you know, I really am not sure we should win. We're going to have to fill 5,000 positions. If we take 4 of those 5,000 positions out of the party, we only have 13,000 members. What are we leaving the party with? Right? So they were very aware of the problems of this, and that the party that had 13,000 members and now, what, 2 million voters, almost 30% of the electorate, was it the kind of party that could sustain sending people into the state and not having those people absorbed by the state? And that was very openly discussed. Very, very openly discussed. So people who think that this, you know, was simply a mindless parliamentarist group are completely wrong. Completely wrong. That's not to say they might not be absorbed by the state, but to say that they are merely parliamentarians looking in an opportunistic way to get in is, I think, really mistaken. Okay. Now, 2 more things. So what is the relationship of the KKE, Communist Party, and Antarsya? I don't want to spend a lot of time on the KKE. People here probably know it better than me. What you need to know is that it has rehabilitated Stalin. Very openly, very clearly said that Stalin was right. The Soviet Union under Stalin was on the right path. It has formed an international alliance of communist parties on that principle. It has been more ready historically since the split in the left to ally with PASOK than to ally with the left. Okay? And it is indeed allied with more traditional elements in the Greek state in certain towns and regions. It seems to me, looking at it and knowing communist parties historically, that although it has a very significant membership, a very committed cadre, many of them young, I want to stress that. Many of them young, many of them university students, that its main goal is to hold on to its party assets. And as the great labor parties of Europe have always done, India as well, I mean, these parties have assets. They have enterprises, and they're not only printing houses, they're import-export enterprises, etc. And they want to hold on to those assets. They don't have a strategy for getting elected and coming to power in the state, but they certainly have an electoral presence. That said, their decision to thumb their noses at Syriza in this very different political context cost them half of their vote, or almost half of their vote. And although they did slightly better than the polls were showing, which is an indication of their base, their mobilized cadre, the ability to get out the vote, they were reduced in the final vote in the second election very considerably. Antarsya, the party of the revolutionary left, and again, those of you who know every Trotskyist in and out of which split occurred will know why the International Socialists in the United States affiliated Greek left is in Syriza, and why the SWP in Britain affiliated Trotskyist organization in Greece is in Antarsya. I can't tell you the ins and outs of that history. Antarsya went through an enormous internal debate after Syriza's electoral breakthrough about whether they should run in this latest election. They only got 1.2% in the May election. They went through an enormous and very divisive debate, and in the end decided to run. Partly to show the flag, and partly because they think that Syriza simply doesn't have a plan B, and staying in Europe is a disaster, and there's going to have to be protests and mobilization on the day that a Syriza government would be formed if one had been formed. Tariq Ali was invited to the same festival as I was. He wrote them at the last minute that he couldn't attend, but he'd be able to attend earlier in the week. So they organized at the Polytechnic, which was the place where the junta was brought down by student protests in 1973 in Athens. They organized at the Polytechnic a meeting for Tariq to speak. Easily 1,000 people were there, and they were overwhelmingly Antarsya, although there were Syriza comrades, especially young comrades there, greeting each other and joking about their different positions in the run-up to the election, etc. Tariq, to my amazement, spent most of his speech talking about Greek politics, which I thought took a lot of chutzpah, someone coming in from the outside and doing that. But then, even more astonishingly, he said, and of course you have to vote for Syriza at this Antarsya meeting of 1,000 militants. And, you know, there were maybe 100 people who thought that they had to politely applaud. And he, of course, recognized this right away, and he knew what he was doing. And he stopped, and he said, "What? What did you say? How many of you are voting for Syriza?" And then maybe another 100. And the leadership, a lot of whom I spoke to in the following days, said they didn't mind Tariq doing it. He had every right to state his own position, but the way he did it was very uncommon, them having brought it. Now this reflects, and obviously what Tariq was reflecting is it was the position of the Fourth International, though he's no longer associated with it, is the feeling of a lot of the European left, which is, you know, we look at what's happening in Greece in terms of shifting the balance of forces in Europe generally. And you're not contributing to that insofar as you're not contributing to, or you're undermining the view of Syriza as a serious left force. I sat down with one of the leading economists of Antarsya. We spent an evening together, and I have to say the most serious analysis of the roots of the crisis for Greece was done by him, without any doubt. You know, he was the one who laid out 100,000 manufacturing jobs having been lost. I have to tell you, you see nothing like this kind of analysis being done by the Communist Party in this kind of detail. 100,000 jobs having been lost by virtue of entering a free trade agreement. We understand what that's all about in terms of certain kinds of manufacturing sectors. Right? The expenses of the Greek military, the enormous expenses of Greek defense, he argued, are not primarily due to Greek paranoia about Turkey, although there's plenty of that, as we know. It's primarily due to NATO commitments. Right? Greek taxation, I mean, those of you who think Greeks aren't paying their taxes, the VAT is 23%, the sales tax is 23%. Okay? It has the lowest, one of the lowest rates of corporate taxation and of direct incomes taxation in Europe. And Syriza's proposal is that since the average rate of taxation of direct taxation in Greece, corporate and income taxation, is 4% lower than the rest of Europe, that it should immediately be raised by that 4%, as well as the wealth tax and special tax on people with over 100,000 euros in income being introduced. So he laid this all out in a really serious way and then said, and there will be a bank run the morning after a Syriza government is formed. And it doesn't have to be an internal bank run, I could have added, because the Greek banks are being kept going now by overnight loans from the German banks, including the German Deutsche Bank, the central bank, the Bundesbank, the central bank. What they do is they lend money to the Greek banks overnight, the Greeks pay them back in the morning, and then they lend it back to them at night. And this is so they can show that their books are balanced at the end of the day. So it wouldn't even involve a run inside Greece, though there might well be. Those with a lot of money already put their money in Switzerland. It could simply happen from the Germans cutting off the overnight funding. And he said, therefore, they have to have a plan B, right? Even apart from creating illusions about Europe. Right? They would immediately have to introduce capital controls. They'd have to introduce two types of exchange controls, one for the internal exchange of euros or dollars into the drachma, one for imports and exports. That's nothing new when you make a break. And it's essentially a program for a Cuba in the Mediterranean. And maybe that's what it would have come to. Maybe that's what it would have come to. The trouble is that there isn't a Soviet Union, right, to support a Cuba in the Mediterranean, number one. Number two, most Greeks don't want it. Number three, the type of party that Syriza is doesn't want a Soviet-style communist party. To their credit, I think. And that goes with Soviet aid, or went with Soviet aid, I should say. So I came away feeling, and I spent a lot of time with very good young Antarsya people as well as with this very senior economist, that they were really pissing in the wind. That they had no politics except getting ready to organize the protests as soon as Syriza got back in, no matter what happened. They certainly, unlike the KKE, saw their Syriza comrades as comrades. They were part of the mobilizations, and Syriza comrades saw them the same way. They were part of the mobilizations together, etc. But what their politics was to get there for the next protest as soon as the election was over. And I think, despite the fact that they talk about creating mass parties and constantly read Gramsci and talk about hegemonic parties, the panel I was on, I was the only one opposed to talk about practical politics, though I didn't talk about Greece. All the other papers, two by Greece, one by a famous Gramsci expert from Britain, were unbelievably abstract, full of quotations from Lukács and Gramsci. Unbelievable, right in the middle of this almost revolutionary moment. Right? And I wonder whether a party like that doesn't really have an insurrectionary politics. For all of their quotation of Gramsci, they really think that you could take the institutions of the Greek state by force, right? And that the rest of the society would then follow along because it's really a Russian situation, in fact. I think obviously anarchists openly think that. But I think the revolutionary left, from what I can see, really ultimately has that position as well. And tragically, an outstanding theorist who I like, Leonidas, the economist, who should have, if he's right, been spending his time camping out at the door of the people, the economists of Syriza, and saying, look, this is what's going to happen and this is what you're going to need to do, was instead going off to Ecuador and Peru to talk to them about economic program and policy and why they should enter into certain type of free trade arrangements. And it was a reflection, I felt, of their isolation from what was going on in the world. Well, obviously the worries that one senior Syriza official articulated, that what if they really do disband the riot police, what would they do in the protests that inevitably would hit them once they were in the state? What happened? And even if they did disband the riot police, but there were some sort of security there, what if they killed somebody? What kind of a situation would it be? I mean, they talked about not being ready. That was one of the examples taken of not being ready. They were joking when they said disband the army, but none of this now is on the agenda. They aren't forming a government. I don't know how sorry anyone is about this. I think they really did want to form a government. It was very, very moving to be at the launch of the party program that Friday, 4 days after I arrived, when Tsipras presented the program. And there were, I don't know, 400 people there, most of them party activists from the various parties inside the coalition, but primarily from Tsipras Pismos. Many of them people who, in their own personal lives, could remember not only the junta, but the repression after the Civil War. And there was a palpable feeling of passion in the room. It was very, very moving. And they started chanting, "The left's time has come," at various points in the speech. And Sakis, the old parliamentarian who introduced the economic portion of the program, said this. And this, I thought, was, I mean, Tsipras did his stuff all about it. We will get rid of the riot police, we will reject the memoranda, we will nationalize the banks, etc. And he was good. But Dragakis said this: "The program for us goes beyond mere slogans and measures, although we know that these are necessary as well. For us, program means a set of values, principles, straight-out orientations, and diligent positions. Our program is based on the values of solidarity, justice, freedom, equality, and environmental responsibility. Based on these values, we will manage, if necessary, even the most mundane tasks. Program for us also means a way of thinking, a way of analyzing, understanding the program, and ranking priorities and needs. And for us, it is the needs of the people that are over and above profits and all selfish and partial interests." And one of their central themes was a society of needs, not a society of profits. "For us, program means a continuous dialogue, a scientific dialogue, a social dialogue, a political dialogue, a dialogue with social movements, a dialogue with citizens. We want to shape our program together through such a continuous dialogue. Program for us also means a process for the formation of social alliances, the building of consensus from below. Unifying the people is an issue in the program. Our program then is the foundation, the blueprint of a broad social alliance among the working people, the people of knowledge, the people of culture, and the youth. It is a social alliance to ward off any further impoverishment in society, to avert decomposition of the productive fabric of our economy, to find a way towards recovery and hope was their central slogan. It is in this sense that the program for us is a continuous process. It is not a static and timeless text. It is not a set of policies. It is a ceaseless endeavor open to new ideas and innovative actions. Finally, when we say program, we mean a political process of not simply managing the current conjuncture, but of opening up new paths, and this is exactly what our program will try to do. It attempts new paths, it attempts to preclude new dangers, It attempts to face up and to make use of the possibilities. Okay, so when I arrived, I said to Michael Spurtilakis, Greg's and my comrade, friend, who's written the Socialist Approach in the Bullet on the history of Syriza, well, I guess what you're really hoping for is that you'll come second and form a strong opposition. And he said, no, I actually worry that we'll be more co-opted and compromised as a parliamentary opposition than we would as a government. When there will be a degree of mobilization against us and behind us that will force us to do radical things in this situation. There's a great danger that we will get absorbed into being a parliamentary opposition because even Synis Pismos only has 13,000 members, and right now the Central Committee is incredibly diverse and confused, and the structure of the party is incredibly amorphous. Syriza had to form itself into an actual official party, which it never was. It was only a coalition of parties, to be eligible for the 50+ seats. But it just now began taking on individual members. Most of its member organizations are what we know as social movements, which means they have no clear election of leaders. They have no clear accountability of leaders. Very few of them have members that pay dues. You know what it's like with activist groups who are very good in organizing protests, right? But don't have the structure of a party and a union. So although the debate is very open, etc., there's not much structure there. And the question of accountability would become very, very difficult, right, had they formed a government, but it also may be very difficult once they go into parliament. And they go into parliament of this size, they will have a lot of money to hire staff, just like the NDP is now doing in Ottawa, right? They can get 2 staff each, these 100 NDP members of parliament. And as Michael said immediately, there'll be loads of opportunists jumping onto our bandwagon. So there are good people are aware of this, and as Michael said, the real battleground is on the terrain of the party itself. And the question is whether we will have the time now to create the kind of party that when some of the leadership go into the state, that leadership will not get absorbed by that state. He's hopeful for 2 reasons, and that is because that state needs to be so fundamentally reconstructed, right? And the whole tradition of the Greek left is to represent the alternative to that patronage-ridden, clientelist, non-bureaucratic, if you like, capitalist state. There's a danger in that because a lot of the things that Syriza is proposing is the kind of thing that you read in IMF structural adjustment programs. You need to be able to collect your taxes, right? You need to have a decent accounting system, right? And you can see some people undertaking those kinds of reforms and doing so in a way that they sell to people at the IMF as part of what they're asking for, and sell to the Greek people as part of what's needed not to have a patron state, but are, standing with one foot in either camp. There's certainly an air, not only amongst the leadership, and I'll just end with this, but even amongst activists, of being embarrassed rather than proud when they're called extremists. This is partly because of the rise of the neo-fascist Golden Dawn. And there's been a lot of equation, in a really disgusting way, between the extremists of the left, by which they mean Syriza, and the extremists of the right. And the journalist who interviewed me for this paper began her interview by saying, isn't that terrible? They're calling us extremists. Right? And the implication of that is that all we're saying is what Krugman is saying, that austerity doesn't make sense. Why are they calling us extremists? Right? We're really in the same camp as Krugman. And I argue against that they should be proud of their radicalism, they should be insisting on their radicalism, and insisting the only alternative to a fascist, new dictatorial Greece is a very radical, revolutionary socialist Greece that is based on democratic economic planning. And, you know, they ran that as the banner headline on the interview in the Left Party newspaper. So they're not hiding that kind of thing either. But yes, the inclination is to try to tack as much as they can to what is the respectable left, given the kind of assault that they're under. So it is an open question. Charles Post has an essay in the Coming Register, which at first I didn't like very much, which is kind of a defense of Leninism, and he says that all the new parties in Europe, he mainly concentrates on Die Linke and Rifondazione Comunista, are replicating the dilemmas of the Second International Social Democrats. They're replicating, do we go into government and become absorbed in managing the system, right? And eventually having to abandon class struggle, right? Or can we in some way continue to be revolutionary? We know where that went, his argument is. And he argues with regard to Die Linke and certainly Rifondazione Comunista that going into government meant that that's exactly what they did. They replicated pre-World War I social democracy, if you like, as farce this time rather than tragedy, given how small they were. Right? And who knows, he may be right about Syriza. But it seems to me that if we're at that moment again in terms of where this great crisis of capitalism is going to lead us, the politics of stopping only at protest, because an insurrectionary strategy is not viable. The politics of only stopping at protest is completely unviable. And therefore, we do have to try over the next 20 years here and elsewhere to create the kind of party that Syriza is now. I only wish we were at the point of the dilemmas it's now facing.